The nursery furniture was already assembled when I walked into my sister's baby shower. A crib in white oak, a glider chair with a cream cushion, a changing table with a hand-painted mobile hanging above it, planets and stars turning slowly on fishing line. My mother stood beside it holding a microphone she'd rented from somewhere, tapping it twice to make sure it worked. "I want to make an announcement," she said, and the room of 30 women went quiet the way rooms do when Diane Calloway asks for silence. "This is a gift from me and your father," she said, looking at my sister. "Every stitch of it. Because some things you don't wait to give until someone's gone." Whitney cried. Everyone clapped. My mother chose my sister that afternoon. That part wasn't new. My mother had chosen my sister over me every single day for 30 years. In 1,000 small ways, nobody in that room would have called cruelty if you'd shown them just one. I stood near the punch bowl with a paper plate of cheese cubes I hadn't touched and did the math in my head, the way I do math for a living, and the number I landed on was $71,400. That was what remained of a trust my grandmother had split evenly between me and my sister 9 years earlier. I'd spent 30 years quietly begging my mother, in every version begging can take that doesn't involve getting on your knees, to notice me the way she noticed Whitney. That afternoon, watching her spend the last of my inheritance on a mobile with planets turning on fishing line, something in me went still and finished. I smiled. I hugged my sister. I drove home to Charleston with both hands steady on the wheel, and I stopped. 3 weeks later, I would stand in that same living room with a folder under my arm, and the day I stopped begging my mother to see me became the day everyone else finally did too. Welcome back to Calm Verdict Stories. I'm Naomi, 33 years old, a claims fraud investigator for a regional insurance company in Charleston, South Carolina. This is the story of how my mother chose my sister over me every single day for 30 years. So quietly, nobody could ever point to a single moment and call it cruelty. And how one baby shower finally taught me to stop begging for a place at a table that was never going to set one for me. If you've ever been the daughter who got the leftover love, the one who had to earn what her sibling was simply given, stay with me. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted cotton warehouse near the Charleston Peninsula, close enough to smell the harbor on humid mornings. I've worked in claims fraud for 7 years, 4 as a junior analyst, and 3 as lead investigator on my team. My job is to read numbers the way other people read faces, to notice when a pattern that looks random from a distance turns out, up close, to be deliberate. I'm good at it. I closed 31 cases last year, more than anyone else in my division, recovered just under $2 million in fraudulent claims for the company. I have a framed certificate on my wall from a regional conference where I spoke on pattern recognition in long-term claims manipulation. My mother has never asked to see it. She's never asked what I do all day. Not really. Not the way she asks Whitney about morning sickness or nursery colors or which pediatrician she's chosen. When people ask my mother what her daughters do, she says, "Whitney's expecting her first, due in the spring, and then, almost as an afterthought, and Naomi's in insurance." Like I sell policies out of a strip mall office. Like the work doesn't have a shape. I grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, a town of live oaks and slow rivers, in a house my father bought with a VA loan after 2 tours in the Army. My father, Walter, worked 31 years at the post office, sorting mail on the early shift, home by 3 every afternoon, a quiet man who read the newspaper cover to cover and rarely offered an opinion on anything that happened inside our house. My mother, Diane, stayed home when we were young, and then worked part-time at a dentist's office doing scheduling and billing. She was, by every outward measure, a devoted mother. She just wasn't devoted evenly. Whitney is 2 years younger than me, and from the time she could walk, She was the child my mother built the house around. I don't say that as exaggeration. I say it as an accountant states an opening balance. It's simply the number we started with. The pattern began so early, I don't have a first memory without it already in place. When I was 6 and Whitney was 4, my mother enrolled us both in ballet at the community center on Boundary Street. I loved it. I practiced in the living room, spun until I got dizzy, begged my mother to watch. Whitney hated it, cried at every class, refused to point her toes, and after 6 weeks, my mother let her quit. I wanted to quit too, not because I hated it, but because it felt unfair that Whitney got to stop trying and I didn't. My mother's answer was the same answer she gave for the next 25 years. "You're the strong one, Naomi. Whitney needs more gentleness." I was 6 years old, and I already understood that strength, in my mother's vocabulary, was a euphemism for less. Less patience, less softness, less of whatever it was Whitney got simply by being the one who cried first. By 2nd grade, the pattern had a shape I could track without knowing yet that I was tracking it. When Whitney had a nightmare, my mother sat with her until she fell back asleep, sometimes an hour, sometimes longer, humming a tune I never learned the name of. When I had a nightmare, my mother told me from the hallway that big girls go back to sleep on their own, and closed my door most of the way, leaving a 2-inch gap of hall light that was supposed to be comfort enough. When Whitney lost a tooth, my mother made a production of the Tooth Fairy, a note left on the pillow in careful cursive, extra glitter dusted on the windowsill. When I lost a tooth, the dollar appeared under my pillow with no ceremony, sometimes a day late. Once not at all until I mentioned it at breakfast and my mother said, "Oh, I forgot, here," and handed me a dollar from her purse like she was paying a toll. I want to be precise about something, because precision is the only tool I trust. My mother never hit me. She never screamed at me in the way some families scream. She never told me, in so many words, that she loved my sister more. If you'd asked her, under oath, whether she favored one daughter over the other, she would have said no, and she would have believed it completely. That's what made it so hard to prove, and so hard to leave. Favoritism built from 1,000 small withdrawals doesn't show up on any single statement. It only shows up when you lay 25 years of statements side by side and add the column. When I was 10, I entered the regional science fair with a project on water filtration, built a working model out of sand, charcoal, and gravel layered in a cut soda bottle, and won 2nd place in the county. My mother came to the awards ceremony, stood in the back, clapped when my name was called, and left before the reception because Whitney had a dance recital that started 40 minutes later across town. I understood, even at 10, that this was reasonable. 2 events, 1 evening, a choice had to be made. What I didn't understand until years later was that it was never once the other way around. In 11 years of overlapping schedules, my mother never once chose my event over Whitney's. Not once. I've gone back through it as an adult, the way I go back through a claimant's history looking for the pattern beneath the noise, and the number holds. 0. When I was 13, I made first chair violin in the county youth orchestra, a position I'd practiced for 2 hours a night, 5 nights a week, for 3 years to earn. The concert was on a Friday in April. My mother told me the week before that she and my father would be there. Front row, she promised. On Thursday, Whitney, then 11, fell off her bike and scraped her knee badly enough to need 4 stitches at the urgent care on Rybot Road. It was, by any measure, a minor injury. Whitney was fine within the hour, sitting up eating a popsicle the nurse gave her, laughing at cartoons on the waiting room television. But my mother stayed the entire evening at the urgent care, past the point where staying was necessary, past the point where my father, who had come home from work specifically to drive me to my concert, texted her twice asking if she was coming. She wasn't. I played my solo to a front row with one empty seat where my mother should have been. My father sitting alone in a folding chair, his tie slightly crooked because he'd rushed. Afterward, in the school parking lot, he hugged me and said, "You were wonderful." And neither of us mentioned the empty seat, because some silences are their own kind of mercy. I want to pause here because I know some of you are already tallying the injuries the way I eventually did. Keep tallying. It only gets clearer. The summer I turned 12, my mother's side of the family held its annual reunion at Aunt Ruth's place in Columbia. 40-some relatives spread across a backyard with folding tables and a rented bounce house for the little kids. There was a tradition at these reunions, a talent show after dinner, cousins doing magic tricks and off-key solos, while the adults sat in lawn chairs with sweet tea. I'd been practicing a piano piece for 6 weeks, a Chopin nocturne I was nowhere near ready for, but wanted badly enough to try. When my turn came, my mother stood up in front of everyone and said, "Oh, let's skip ahead. Whitney's been dying to show everyone her cartwheels." And the whole yard laughed and clapped while Whitney did 4 cartwheels across the grass, and I sat back down at the folding table with my hands still shaking from nerves nobody was going to let me use. Aunt Ruth found me by the dessert table 20 minutes later and said quietly, so only I could hear it, "That wasn't right, Naomi. And I want you to know I saw it." I didn't understand yet why it mattered that someone had seen it. I would understand it fully 21 years later, in a room full of people, when Ruth would be the one standing beside me instead of watching from a folding chair. The summer I turned 15, I broke my wrist falling off the back steps carrying a stack of library books, a clean fracture that needed a cast for 6 weeks. My mother drove me to the urgent care, sat in the waiting room scrolling her phone, and when the doctor asked if I needed anything for the pain, my mother answered before I could, "She's tough. She'll be fine with ibuprofen." That same week, Whitney developed what the pediatrician eventually diagnosed as a mild case of seasonal allergies, sneezing, watery eyes, nothing more. And my mother took 2 days off work to stay home with her, made her chicken soup she didn't need, propped pillows around her on the couch like she was recovering from surgery. I spent those same 2 days typing one-handed, my cast propped on a pillow of its own that nobody had arranged, trying to keep up with summer reading assignments so I wouldn't fall behind. I never once heard my mother describe me as tough in a tone that sounded like a compliment. It was always the explanation for why I didn't need what my sister was getting, the reason offered instead of the comfort withheld. High school widened the gap the way high school widens everything. I earned a 4.2 grade point average, ran cross-country, worked 16 hours a week at a bookstore on Bay Street to save for a car, and applied, without any help from my parents on the paperwork, to 11 colleges. Whitney, meanwhile, struggled academically, and my mother's response to every struggle was not correction but protection. When Whitney's algebra grades slipped, my mother hired a tutor, 3 sessions a week, $80 an hour, for an entire semester. When my calculus grades slipped 1 quarter the same semester, because I was working closing shifts at the bookstore until 11 most nights, my mother told me I needed better time management. Whitney got resources. I got advice. Prom arrived my senior year. My mother took Whitney, then a sophomore, dress shopping for a school dance Whitney wasn't even attending yet. "Just to look," my mother said. "So she has ideas for when it's her turn." They spent an entire Saturday at 3 different boutiques in Savannah, came home with photographs on my mother's phone of Whitney in 6 different gowns, my mother narrating each one like a pageant judge. For my actual prom, the one happening in 3 weeks, I found my own dress on clearance at a shop in the outlet mall, $62. Tried it on alone in a fitting room with a cracked mirror, and paid for it with money I'd earned shelving paperbacks. My mother saw it hanging on my closet door the night before prom and said, "That's nice, honey." in the tone of voice she used for weather she hadn't chosen and couldn't change. I graduated valedictorian of a class of 211 students. I gave a speech about resilience that I wrote myself, revised 11 times, practiced in front of my bedroom mirror until I had it memorized cold. My mother sat in the audience and afterward in the gymnasium lobby crowded with families and balloons. The first thing she said to me was, "Don't let this go to your head. You still have to help your sister with her homework this summer. She's starting to fall behind again." Not congratulations. Not "I'm proud of you." A reminder that my achievement came with an assignment attached, the way it always did, the strong one absorbing what the gentle one couldn't carry. College tuition was where the arithmetic stopped being abstract and became a number I could point to. I earned a partial academic scholarship to the University of South Carolina, enough to cover about 60% of tuition. My parents told me, when I asked about covering the rest, that money was tight, that they'd help where they could, which turned out to mean a few $100s here and there. Inconsistent, apologetic, always followed by a reminder that I was resourceful, that I'd figure it out. I figured it out. I worked 20 hours a week at a campus call center, took out federal loans, and graduated 4 years later with just under $28,000 in student debt that I finished paying off myself at age 30, 3 years ago. A milestone I celebrated alone with a bottle of cheap Prosecco because there was no one else who understood what that number had cost me. Whitney started at a community college 2 years later, dropped out after 3 semesters, and when she decided at 22 that she wanted to try a certificate program in medical billing instead, my parents paid the entire tuition, $4,200 in a single check. No loans, no call center shifts, no 4-year grind. When I mentioned, gently, that I'd had to work my way through school, my mother said, "That was different, Naomi. You were always so capable. Whitney needs the support to find her footing." I was 24 years old the first time I understood, with real clarity, that capable was a word my mother used to justify giving me less. If this is starting to sound familiar, if you've ever heard the word capable used against you like a closed door, keep watching, because the arithmetic was about to get a lot more literal. My grandmother, Louise Calloway, my father's mother, died when I was 26. She was 83, sharp until the end, a retired school teacher who'd taught 3rd grade in Beaufort for 38 years and never remarried after my grandfather passed. Louise was the one person in my family who saw me clearly. She used to take me fishing on Saturday mornings when I was small, just the 2 of us, sitting on the dock behind her house on the Coosaw River, and she'd ask me real questions. What are you reading? What do you want to build? What's the thing you're proudest of this week? And she'd wait for the actual answer instead of moving on to Whitney's turn before I'd finished mine. Louise had built a modest but real estate over her lifetime, a paid-off house, some savings, and a life insurance policy. And 9 years before she died, when I was 24 and Whitney was 22, she'd set up an irrevocable trust worth $150,000, split evenly, $75,000 each, for her 2 granddaughters. She told me about it herself, on the dock, the summer she set it up. "It's not a fortune," she said, "but it's yours, both of you, equal. No arguments. Your mother's going to manage the account until you're both established. But the day either of you needs it for something real, a house, an emergency, starting a life, it's there." She squeezed my hand when she said it. I remember thinking it was the only time in my life someone had given me something without attaching a comparison to my sister. My mother was named trustee. That detail mattered more than I understood at the time. For years, I never asked about the trust. I didn't need to. I was building my career, saving what I could on my own, paying down my loans, and the money felt like a promise sitting quietly in the background rather than something I needed to draw on. Whitney, on the other hand, asked often, When Whitney and her husband Cole wanted a down payment for their first house 4 years ago, my mother arranged for $40,000 to be released from the trust. Whitney's half plus a portion of what my mother described to me, when I finally asked, as a loan against future distributions that would even out later. I didn't push. I trusted my mother, the way you trust a bank you've never had reason to audit. When Whitney and Cole got married 3 years ago, my mother covered $11,000 of wedding costs, flowers, a videographer, a band. Money, she told me at the time, came from her and my father's personal savings, not the trust. I believed that too. 18 months ago, I asked my mother directly, for the first time, about my share. I was considering a down payment on a condo in Charleston, a genuine milestone, and I wanted to know where things stood. My mother's answer came quickly, too quickly. The kind of quickness that in my professional life is itself a red flag. "There's not much left, Naomi," she said. Louise's estate had some unexpected expenses, taxes, upkeep on the house before it sold, and honestly, some of it went to help your sister get established. "You're doing so well on your own. I didn't think you needed it the way she did." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. I didn't think you needed it the way she did. $75,000, my grandmother's gift, reframed as something I hadn't needed, as though need was the qualifying condition and not equal ownership. I let it go. I told myself the exact things I now tell claimants' families when they're grieving and don't want to look too closely at where an estate went. Grief makes people generous in strange directions. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Then came the baby shower, and the crib, and the glider chair, and the mobile with the planets turning on fishing line, and the microphone my mother had rented so that 30 women could watch her announce a gift she was calling hers and my father's, when I already suspected, standing there with a paper plate of cheese cubes, that I was looking at the last of my inheritance assembled into furniture for a baby who wasn't due for 6 more weeks. I didn't confront her that day. I've learned, in 7 years of investigating fraud for a living, that confronting someone before you have the full picture only teaches them to hide better. So I drove home, and the next morning, I did what I do at work every single day. I started pulling records. As my grandmother's remaining next of kin, along with my father, I was listed as a contingent co-executor on the small residual estate account that had stayed open after the main trust distributions, a formality nobody had ever activated because there'd been no need. There was a need now. I called the estate attorney, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Paget, who'd handled my grandmother's affairs for over a decade, and asked, formally, for a full accounting of trust disbursements since the account's founding. It took him 9 days to compile it. When the email arrived, I printed all 31 pages at my office on a Tuesday evening, after everyone else had gone home, because I didn't want to read this at a printer anyone else might walk past. The account had opened 9 years earlier at $150,000. The first 5 years showed almost no activity. Small interest accrual, the balance holding steady, exactly as my grandmother had intended. Then, starting 6 years ago, the withdrawals began. $12,000, described in the trustee's notes as educational support, dispersed the same month Whitney enrolled in her medical billing certificate program, though the certificate itself had cost $4,200, which meant nearly $8,000 had gone somewhere the notes didn't specify. $40,000 4 years ago for the house down payment, exactly as I'd known. $11,000 3 years ago, the month of Whitney's wedding, the same $11,000 my mother had told me came from her and my father's personal savings. $6,000 18 months ago, described only as family support, dispersed 2 weeks after I'd asked my mother about my share and been told there wasn't much left. And finally, $4,100, 6 weeks before the baby shower, for what the ledger listed as nursery furnishings. I added the column the way I add every column, twice, by hand, before I trust a total. $73,100 withdrawn, over 6 years, every single disbursement benefiting Whitney, either directly or through what my mother had described to me as her and my father's own money. My remaining balance in the trust, according to the final page, stood at $1,900. Of the original $75,000 my grandmother had set aside specifically and equally for me, 97% of it was gone, and I had never approved a single withdrawal, never been asked, never even been told the account was being drawn down at all. Not once in 6 years had my name appeared beside a disbursement. I sat in my empty office, with those 31 pages spread across my desk, the way I spread evidence across a desk for a claim I'm about to refer for prosecution, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which wasn't rage. It was a strange, cold clarity. The same clarity I feel when a pattern that's been nagging at me for weeks finally resolves into a single, undeniable shape. My mother hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't been careless. She had made 7 separate, deliberate decisions over 6 years, each one small enough to explain away on its own, that together added up to erasing my inheritance and calling it help for your sister. I called my father that night. I don't often call my father directly, because conversations with him have a way of dissolving into agreement with whatever my mother has already decided, but I needed to hear his voice before I decided what to do next. "Dad," I said, "did you know Mom's been pulling money out of the trust Grandma set up for me and Whitney?" There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear the television playing faintly in the background. And then he said, quietly, in a voice that had none of its usual steadiness, "I knew about the house. I didn't know about the rest, Naomi. Your mother handles that account. I don't ask." "I don't ask" was the sentence that told me everything about the shape of my parents' marriage and the shape of my childhood in 4 words. My father had spent 35 years not asking, and I had spent 26 years living inside the consequences of what he never asked about. I called my Aunt Ruth next, my father's younger sister, who lived 2 hours away in Colombia and had never been especially close to my mother, a distance I'd never fully understood until now. Ruth had been at my grandmother's side during the trust's creation, had witnessed the paperwork, and when I read her the numbers over the phone, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "Naomi, your grandmother made me promise something before she died. She said if the day ever came that you needed proof of what she intended, I should tell you the truth, even if it hurt your mother to hear it. She showed me the original trust documents herself, years ago, sat me down at her kitchen table, and made me read every page so I'd understand exactly what she wanted. Equal, Naomi. She used that word 4 times in one conversation. Equal. She didn't trust your mother completely even then. She just didn't think she'd live long enough to need to worry about it." I called Mr. Paget again after I hung up with Ruth, this time not to request records, but to ask him directly whether the trustee's discretion my mother kept referencing actually existed anywhere in the document. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a professional choosing his words carefully around a client's family conflict. And then he said, "Ms. Calloway, I drafted that trust myself. There is no discretion clause. Your grandmother was explicit about that during our first meeting. She said she'd seen too many families where good intentions got used to justify unequal treatment, and she didn't want that possibility built into her own wishes. The trustee's role was administrative, not interpretive. I asked him whether he'd ever raised concerns about the pattern of withdrawals over the past 6 years. He said the disbursement requests had always come with a stated purpose attached: education, housing, family support, and that unless someone flagged an issue, his role was to process them, not to audit intent. Nobody had ever flagged an issue, because nobody but my mother had ever seen the statements. Ruth mailed me a copy of the original notarized trust agreement within the week. $75,000 each, named explicitly, no ambiguity, no clause giving my mother discretion to redirect funds based on need. My mother hadn't been managing the account according to my grandmother's wishes. She'd been managing it according to her own arithmetic, the same arithmetic that had governed every decision since I was 6 years old. The strong one gets less because the strong one can carry less. I spent the next 2 weeks building a file the way I build every file before I bring it to a supervisor. Methodical, dated, cross-referenced. I laid the original trust document beside the disbursement ledger, highlighted every withdrawal in one color, and every stated justification my mother had given me over the years in another. And where the colors didn't match, and they never matched, I wrote the discrepancy in the margin in my own handwriting. $12,000 for a $4,000 certificate program. $11,000 my mother had claimed came from personal savings. $6,000 disbursed 2 weeks after she told me there wasn't much left. I made 3 copies. I know professionally that you always bring backups. Whitney's baby shower had happened 3 weeks before the due date, but there was one more family gathering scheduled before the baby arrived. My father's 60th birthday, and my mother had turned it into an event, the way she turned everything Whitney adjacent into an event. She'd rented the fellowship hall at First Presbyterian, hired a caterer for pulled pork sandwiches, and invited what felt like half of Beaufort, my father's co-workers from the post office, my parents' church friends, 3 cousins and their spouses, my mother's book club, and, because I'd asked her to personally, Aunt Ruth, who drove down from Columbia especially, 18 place settings. A banner that said, "Happy 60th Walter," and, tucked at the edge of the head table, one more chair Whitney had reserved for the baby's name announcement she and Cole had been planning for weeks. I want to pause here, because I know some of you are waiting for me to say I confronted her right there in the lobby of the moment, the way you'd expect from every story like this. I didn't. I've learned that timing matters as much as truth does. A truth delivered in private can be denied, reframed, negotiated down to a misunderstanding behind closed doors. I needed witnesses who couldn't be managed afterward with a phone call and a softened voice. I needed the truth delivered exactly once, in a room my mother couldn't control the narrative of later. I drove to Beaufort that Sunday with the folder on the passenger seat. 3 copies, dated, highlighted, cross-referenced. And I parked outside the fellowship hall where the parking lot was already half full. Cars I recognized from 20 years of Sunday services and summer cookouts. Dinner started the way these things always started. My mother working the room in a floral dress, greeting every guest by name. My father shaking hands near the door, looking pleased and slightly overwhelmed. Whitney glowing in the particular way pregnant women glow when a room has spent months arranging itself around them. Cole telling a story about a coworker that nobody quite followed but everyone laughed at anyway. Aunt Ruth found me near the drink table and squeezed my hand once, hard, the way she had at that reunion 21 years earlier. "I brought my reading glasses," she said quietly, which was the closest thing to "Are you ready?" that Ruth knew how to say. I ate slowly. I answered when spoken to. I waited. After the plates were cleared, my mother had the caterer wheel out a sheet cake, white with blue icing script, and my father blew out 60 candles across 2 cakes while 18 people sang. And then Whitney stood up, glowing, and tapped her glass with a fork until the whole hall quieted. "We have an announcement too," she said, smiling at the room, at our mother especially, the way she'd smiled at our mother her entire life, certain of the audience she was about to receive. "We're naming her Louise," Whitney said, "after Grandma." A ripple of soft applause went around the tables. My mother's hand went to her chest, and she made a sound that was half gasp, half sob, and said, "Oh, that's beautiful. That's just beautiful. She would have loved that." And for a moment, the whole hall softened around the name of a woman I had spent the last 3 weeks reading like a ledger. That's when I stood up, folder in hand, and walked to the front of the hall where the cake still sat with its 2 half-melted rows of candles. "Before we move past Grandma's name," I said, loud enough to carry to the back tables, "I think there's something everyone here should know about what happened to what she actually left behind." The hall went quiet, the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses a shift it isn't ready for. 18 forks stopped moving. A woman from my mother's book club set down her sweet tea. My mother's smile didn't drop immediately. It froze, the way a smile does when the person wearing it is buying time to understand what's happening in front of everyone she's ever tried to impress. "What do you mean, honey?" she said. I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I've learned, from 7 years of reading claim files and delivering hard numbers to people who don't want to hear them, that volume is the first thing people use to fill a silence they're afraid of, and I wasn't afraid of this one. "Grandma set up a trust 9 years ago," I said, looking at Whitney first, because I wanted her to hear this before she heard it filtered through our mother. $75,000 for each of us, equal. I have the original notarized document here, if anyone wants to read it. I've had Mom listed as trustee this whole time, which meant I trusted her to manage it the way Grandma asked. I slid the ledger across the table, the highlighted copy, toward my father first, because he was the one person at that table who had never once, in 31 pages, been consulted. Over the last 6 years, $73,100 has come out of my half. Every disbursement benefited Whitney: the house down payment, part of the wedding, the certificate program, the nursery furniture from the shower 3 weeks ago. My balance right now is $1,900. Whitney's face did something I'd never seen it do before. A kind of sliding collapse, confusion giving way to something closer to fear. "That's not," she started, and stopped, and looked at our mother instead of me, the way she'd looked to our mother her entire life for the version of events she was supposed to believe. My mother's hand came down flat on the table, not a slam, just a placement, the sound of someone steadying herself. "This is not the time for this, Naomi," she said, her voice dropping into the register she used when she needed a room to fall back in line. "We are celebrating your father's birthday. We just named this baby after your grandmother, and you're bringing spreadsheets to the table." "I'm not bringing spreadsheets," I said. "I'm bringing the truth about where Grandma's money actually went, since apparently nobody else at this table was ever told." I looked at my father. "Did you know the $11,000 for Whitney's wedding came out of the trust? You told me it came from your savings." He was quiet, but this time his eyes didn't go to the television that wasn't even on. They went to my mother, and something in his face had shifted too. A man realizing, at 60 years old, exactly how much he'd allowed himself not to ask. Cole cleared his throat and said quietly, "I didn't know any of this either, Diane. I thought the down payment was a gift from you and Walter." My mother's composure was starting to fracture at the edges, the way composure does when it's built on the assumption that no one is ever going to check the math. "I did what was best for this family," she said, her voice climbing. "Naomi has always landed on her feet. She didn't need it the way Whitney did. You have always been the strong one, Naomi, you know that. You've always been able to figure things out on your own. And Whitney needed help," I finished for her. Because I've heard that sentence in every version it comes in for 27 years. And I didn't. Except I did, Mom. I had $28,000 in student loans I paid off entirely by myself while you were funding Whitney's tuition in full. I bought my dress for prom with bookstore money while you took Whitney shopping for a dance she wasn't even old enough to attend. I have never once asked you for anything, and the one time I did ask, 18 months ago, about my own inheritance, you told me there wasn't much left. There was. There was almost $73,000 left, and you just hadn't spent it on me yet. Whitney was crying now. Not the performative kind, something quieter and more frightened. I didn't know, Naomi. I swear I didn't know where any of it came from. Mom just said it was help, family help. I never asked because I never had to ask. You know how she stopped herself before she finished the sentence, because I think, for the first time in her life, my sister heard what she'd been about to say out loud. You never had to ask because I was the one who had to ask, and I was the one who got told no. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor, loud enough that the caterer in the back froze mid-step. Everything I did out of love, she said, her voice cracking now, tears coming fast, carrying to every table in the hall. You have no idea what it's like to raise two girls who need such different things, Naomi. You were always fine. You were always going to be fine. And I thought I was helping the one who actually needed it. Her voice climbed further, fragmenting. You have always thought you were better than the rest of us. Coming in here, today, of all days, ruining your father's birthday, ruining Whitney's moment. Do you have any idea how this looks? A woman 2 tables back, one of the church friends, murmured something to her husband and reached for her purse. Another guest, my father's supervisor from the post office, looked down at his plate like it might offer an exit. Aunt Ruth stood too, quietly, and came to stand beside me, not saying anything, just present, the reading glasses still folded in her hand. I stood as well, not to match my mother's volume, just to be level with her, the way I stand across a table from a claimant I'm about to tell a hard truth to. I need you to hear this clearly, Mom, I said, and I kept my voice exactly where it had been the whole time, flat, precise. The voice I use when a number has to be said once and understood the first time, in front of everyone who needed to hear it once and understand it the first time too. Whitney needing more from you was never the problem. The problem is that for 27 years, you told yourself giving her more meant I needed less. Those were never the same thing. I needed you too. I just stopped asking. Because every time I asked, I learned the answer was going to be no. And eventually, a person stops knocking on a door that's never once opened. The hall was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and, somewhere behind me, my father's chair creaking as he shifted his weight. The sound of a man deciding, finally, that this was a moment he could no longer sit out. If you've ever handed someone a truth this plainly and watched the room finally see what you'd been carrying alone for years, you know there's no relief in it, not right away. There's just the silence after, and what people choose to do with it. Keep watching, because what happened over the following weeks mattered more than anything said at that table. Whitney didn't speak for the rest of that dinner. My mother sat back down, but she didn't touch her plate again, and my father, for the first time in my adult life, reached across the table and put his hand over mine, not saying anything, just letting the weight of it sit there. I left an hour later with the folder still on the table because I didn't need it back. I'd made my point with the original, and I'd kept the copies at home, dated, filed, the way you keep records of anything you might need to reference again. 18 witnesses do not stay quiet, not in a town the size of Beaufort. Within 2 weeks, my mother's book club, the same women who'd been sipping sweet tea at table 4 when I stood up with that folder, had quietly reshuffled itself around a different host. The meetings moving to another member's house without my mother ever officially being asked to step aside. She noticed. She mentioned it to me once, brittle, offhand, said something about how people love to gossip and she supposed she'd become the topic for a season. The church friends were kinder about it, but no less final. A few polite excuses when she volunteered for the fall festival committee. A seat that had always been hers going, without much discussion, to someone else. My mother had spent 30 years building a version of herself as the devoted family matriarch, generous, self-sacrificing, and it turned out that version couldn't survive 31 pages of bank statements read aloud in a room full of the people she'd built it in front of. Nobody organized a boycott. Nobody needed to. A town remembers what it watches happen at a birthday party, and it recalibrates quietly, one declined invitation at a time. The weeks after unfolded slowly, the way water finds its level after something upstream has broken open. My mother called me 4 times that first week. I let 3 go to voicemail. The 4th, I answered. Mostly because I could hear from the area code it was her cell and not the house line, which meant she was calling from somewhere private. Maybe her car, maybe the porch, somewhere my father couldn't hear whatever version of this she'd decided to try on me first. "Naomi," she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, and I want you to know I never meant to hurt you. I just always thought you were the one who didn't need as much watching over." I told her, the way I tell claimants who want absolution before they've made restitution, that I understood how she'd told herself that story, but that understanding it didn't undo the $73,000, and that I needed her to talk to Mr. Paget about restoring what remained of my share before we talked about anything else. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "That money's spent, Naomi. I don't have it to give back." I said, "Then we need to talk about what you and Dad do have, because Grandma's wishes were clear, and I'm not interested in being told a second time that there isn't enough for me." My father, it turned out, had opinions of his own once he started forming them. 2 weeks after the dinner, he called me, not my mother, just him, and told me he'd gone through the couple's own savings and retirement accounts with a legal pad the way he used to sort mail, methodically, one line at a time, and had calculated that between what remained of their savings and a portion of his pension he was willing to restructure, they could restore $22,000 of what had been taken. Not all of it, but a real number. A number with intention behind it instead of an excuse. "It's not everything you're owed," he said, and his voice had a steadiness in it I hadn't heard from him in years, maybe ever. "But it's what I can put right. And I should have been asking these questions a long time ago, Naomi. I'm sorry I never did." Whitney called me a month after the dinner, after the baby, a girl, Louise Marie, had been born, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, 3 weeks earlier than the due date the crib had been assembled for. Whitney's voice on the phone was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I've been thinking about it every day since dinner," she said. "I didn't know, Naomi, but I also never asked. I never once asked where anything came from, because it was just always there for me. And I think somewhere I knew not to ask, because asking might mean it would stop. I sat with that for a moment, because it was the most honest thing my sister had said to me in years, and I told her that I believed her, and that I didn't need her to fix what our mother had done. I just needed her to stop being surprised every time I mentioned that things had never been equal. She asked if I wanted to meet the baby. I said yes. I drove to Beaufort on a Saturday morning in late spring, 6 weeks after that dinner, and held my niece for the first time in the same nursery my grandmother's diverted money had furnished. The crib and the glider chair and the mobile with the planets still turning slowly whenever the window was cracked. I sat in the glider, little Louise asleep against my shoulder, and I thought about my grandmother on the dock behind her house on the Coosaw River, asking me what I was proudest of that week, waiting for the real answer instead of moving on to someone else's turn. I thought about the fact that this baby carried her name now, and that whatever her name had cost, the child herself hadn't asked for any of it, and didn't deserve to grow up inside the same arithmetic I had. Whitney came in and sat on the ottoman across from me, watching us. "I'm going to do better," she said, quietly, not as an apology exactly, more like a decision being spoken out loud for the first time. I don't want her growing up watching how our mother treated you and thinking that's just what families do. I didn't say it would be easy. I've read enough files to know that patterns this old don't dissolve in a single conversation, even a true one, even a necessary one. My mother still, most weeks, finds a way to mention how well Whitney's doing before she asks a single question about my work, my life, the promotion I was up for that spring. Old grooves don't fill in just because someone finally names them, but something did change that dinner. Something real, measurable. The kind of change I trust because I can point to the exact numbers behind it. $22,000, restored, deposited into an account with my name on it and no one else's. A father who calls now, sometimes just to ask how work is going, no occasion required. A sister who texts photos of her daughter with captions that don't compare us anymore. Just, "Louise smiled today. Thought you'd want to see." 6 months after that dinner, I drove out to the dock behind what used to be my grandmother's house, sold now to a young family who let me walk down when I ask. I sat on the weathered boards where she used to ask me real questions and wait for real answers. And I thought about the version of myself who spent 27 years trying to prove she was worth choosing, who kept showing up to recitals and shower gifts and pot roast dinners, hoping that eventually the arithmetic would balance itself out if I was just patient enough, good enough, strong enough to wait. That girl doesn't exist anymore. Not because I stopped loving my family, but because I finally understood that love you have to keep proving your way into isn't the kind my grandmother meant when she used the word equal 4 times in one conversation at her sister-in-law's kitchen table. I still visit Beaufort. I still sit at that table, but I don't come with an open hand anymore, waiting to see what's left over after everyone else has been served first. I stopped begging my mother to choose me the day I finally proved on paper that she never had. I come now as someone who knows her own worth doesn't require an accounting from anyone else, because I did the accounting myself, and the numbers, finally, told the truth. If you've spent years being the one who figured it out on her own, while someone else got handed everything without asking, I hope this story reminds you that naming the pattern out loud is not betrayal. It's just arithmetic, finally done in the open. The day you stop begging to be chosen is the day you finally get to choose yourself. Share this with someone who's still waiting to be chosen. Leave a comment if you've ever been the strong one who needed help too, and subscribe because on this channel, every ledger eventually balances.